Hi brothers and sisters. I thought we'd do a video where we managed to unlock the mysteries of the Bible using the key of David. And I went through and I collected quite a few today. I know this is probably going to be more than one part. It'll probably actually be anywhere from 2 to 3 parts, of course. What's the key of David? That's the first thing that we discovered that allowed us to break down so many of the mysteries and what they call dark sayings, which really, when you go in and you look at that term, dark sayings, in the Bible, when you hit it, it really means the riddles, the unsolved riddles that we don't really know what they mean. But once we discovered what the key of David was, it was with this key that we were able to unlock many of those mysteries. And I went through today and I collected up at least 40, just making notes on them. And we may throw in a study or two if my camera keeps working. It's been giving me great difficulty. But I do think these last 2 to 3 videos will probably be the wrap up for my channel. I think I'm going to be done just in time to get a new computer with a new camera on it. It's funny how that works, but I'm saying that anyway. I just don't know what else there is that I can possibly show you. That the key of David, knowing what the key of David is, can't show you. And there goes my camera starting and stopping, so I may not even get one video out. I apologize with the starting and stopping of the camera. I've tried to go in and delete a lot of information off my computer, and I think I'll continue to do that to try to lighten the load that it's carrying now. But in the summer of 2017, I was finally able to fully grasp what the key of David was. And I began my study in 2011, just seriously question the theology from a woman's perspective is what I found myself doing. And I found myself one night down on my knees by my bed, just pouring my heart out to God and saying, why did you even bother, creating us? If all we were ever going to be was going to be to blame and with all the things that I knew that I had been taught from the time I was a little girl and old enough to comprehend the theology of Christianity that was pumped at me, for me it was sorely missing the aspect of the feminine, and it left me feeling very empty and very not vital, and very unnecessary in the whole scheme of things. Is really the idea that you walk away and then you're left carrying this heavy burden on you. This is what I've come to realize. And so in the summer of 2017, after all these years of study, so that was about 2011, I began to seriously question things. And in 2013, I was in hard study. I began in what you'd call hard study. And then in 2017, it just, I had been hitting at it, and then finally, the Lord just revealed it to me. And so that was what the key of David was. And with me down on my knees, what I really was asking the Lord was, who am I in God? And that was the question that kept coming to the forefront. Because everything that I had been taught me that God was a triple male, he. The Messiah was he, the Word was he, the Spirit was he, the water was he, everything was ruled by a king, a he. And I just began to say, well, there's something wrong with this. There's something sorely missing in this. And especially when the men would take the pulpit, they would often say, don't go towards the theology that tickles your ears. And then it began to occur to me that they were preaching a doctrine and a theology that really tickled theirs. And so, when I came to the end of myself, I guess, that's when I found myself down on my knees just saying, God, you show me who I am. Wipe the board clean of everything I think I know, and you show it to me. You go in and you show it to me with a clean set of eyes And so I began in earnest. I really did. And in the summer of 2017, I saw what the key of David is. So what we realized was the key of David was, it took a series of passages, and we'll look at them right briefly because I got like 40 of these maybe to go through, and I doubt I'm going to get through them tonight. So passages for the key of David, we found them, it began in Isaiah 22, Jeremiah 9, Micah 2, Job 31 verse 33, Ezekiel 13, 1 Kings 11:26. All right, this is an important chapter, and this is vital to our understanding. Genesis 49 verses 22 to 24. And it was there that we discovered the archers, called your Baals there, B-A-A-L, your husband, Lord Master, who was shooting at these branches, which is identified as daughters, that was passing through the gates or over the wall, it says there. And what we understand was that it was King Solomon who was actually daubing up these so-called gates, calling them breaches, in the wall of David, his father. And what we found was that that was actually, he was eliminating the daughters of Zion from their rightful birthright. And that's what we discovered was the key of David. And so once we understood this key, we understood it was the daughters of Zion. And this key, the key of David, is in total opposition to the key of Solomon, which isn't actually mentioned in the Bible. It's not actually mentioned in the Bible, but is known as the harlot Babylon, daughter Babylon. The harlot that Masons, we look at Freemasons, and if you know anything about Freemasons, it revolves around the key of Solomon in their books. And so the harlot, they built up the harlot in the world so they could play God. And that's why we have he. We have the Messiah, he. We have the ruler as a male. We have the word as male. We have the water as male. We have the spirit as male. And we have woman as the doormat bearing the burden of it all, the blame. That's basically what we understand. So with the key of David, and we're going to try to go through these pretty fast, otherwise it's going to be a very long video, that we were able to unlock these mysteries in the Bible with this key of David. And it's only when you understand that the key of David is representing the daughters of Zion as the righteous spirit that man rejected a covenant with for the harlot Babylon that he chose to build up and make a covenant with so he could exalt himself. So with the key of David, we were able to understand these following mysteries. So the Azazel goat. We're just going to go through these quick. I've got videos up on all of these topics that I'm about to mention. So the Azazel goat was the scapegoat. It was a she-goat. That we then find that she-goat as the Azazel goat that they want to call devil, and everything else, a fallen angel, anything you can think of negative, that's what they want to call this Azazel goat. But the Azazel goat was your scapegoat. And it is a she-goat. And you find that she-goat in Genesis 15:9. In that covenant called the Abrahamic covenant. She, the daughter of Zion, had to bear the sins for what Israel had done and got cast out into a land not inhabited, which then becomes known as the Gentile nations, which was a promise made by God in Psalm 106. When we got studying this passage, Psalm 106, 23 to 29 in particular, God had told the men of Israel, if you reject my scepter and my glory and the way that I rule, I'll cast it out into the lands of the Gentiles, and you won't have her you won't have her as your ruler, as your scepter. The crown won't go to you. And so, but it's a promise also that includes Israel's birthright, and she's identified as the red heifer. The heifer in this Abrahamic covenant that you see in Genesis 15:9, that first animal heifer, is representing the nation of Israel, a feminine. But we see in Psalm 106, 23 to 29. Now we're actually going to take a deeper look at that. And we're also going to look at the doe of the morning in the chapter that she appears in, which is Psalm 22. So another one, so we'll do that in a minute, but we'll go through a couple more very quick. So Baal worship. We understood Baal worship and how it related to headship doctrine. How did we do that? Well, if you go into the book of Esther, the king decreed a law stating that all wives would bow to their husbands as Lord and Master. And we know that because the word for husband there is Baal. These same men, these same archers who shot painful words, wicked words, gave false testimonies against these daughters of Zion and actually gnashed at them with their teeth, is what it stated in the scriptures, to take her out of the land. And when they thought they had finally removed the spirit of her covenant from the land, they rejoiced. Because it meant that they got to play God and write all the laws, yoke their sister, and that she was going to play the harlot for him. That's basically what we understand in allegorical terminology. So, let me see here. So Baal worship and how it relates to headship doctrine. The king and Esther and bowing to husband is not from God. It came from man writing his own laws. And we see the king doing that. The kings in Psalm 2 took, what does it say? The kings took counsel against the yoke of God, which was given by the daughters of Zion. Yoke is another word for the law. And that's why Christ says, my burden is light. But these daughters comes to be heavily burdened with this yoke of blame. And so when we realize, again, like I said, what the key of David is, it leads us through many different studies. Number 4, the lilies of the covenant, the Shushan gate, Song of Songs, she's called the lily of the valley, which then leads us to the passage that you're going to find in Psalms, the lilies of the covenant. So Psalm 60, Psalm 80, Psalm 45, you'll find this, the lilies of the covenant. And the lilies of the covenant we understood to be the daughters of Zion, that is being shepherded by the Shulamite in Song of Songs. That's why you bring in, I am the rose of Sharon, the lily of the valley. And it's talking about these, they're identified as the daughters of Zion and a flock of she-goats, which takes us right back to the Genesis 15:9 covenant of the Abrahamic covenant that she appears in. And so as we follow this key of David all out, it's gradually expanding our understanding of this covenant. So number 5, understanding that the red heifer in Scripture is representing Israel, burned to ashes. Also representing the Holy Spirit in Hebrews 9, verses 13 and 14. You go in and it identifies that red heifer as the Holy Spirit that cleansed the temple. Alright? It is used to cleanse the temple. It is an extension of Israel's birthright in Isaiah 49 and Isaiah 54. Heifer in the Genesis 15:9 covenant is also identified as Israel, and the she-goat as the lilies of the covenant in Song of Songs, and then identified as a flock of she-goats, and then identified as the glory that sits between the cherubim in Psalm 60, Psalm 80, Isaiah 35. The rose of Sharon there blooms in the desert. Hosea 14, Israel will blossom like the lily. They got he, it's a she, it's identified as a she. It is the woman's seed that was blessed, Israel, she, which means simply that you trace your lineage through the daughters, not the sons. It was the daughters' lineage you traced it through. Identified as the queen that comes from the north kingdom, which is Joseph, Ephraim. Israel is in Joseph's blessings in Genesis 49, 22 to 24. And Deuteronomy 33 says it all, really, when you get understanding that you're talking about a birthright and the blessing there. And they both go to this queen that comes from the north. Daughter Zion, called the right hand and God upon this earth. That's found when you put together these three particular passages, Isaiah 51, Isaiah 52, and Psalm 89. So, number 7 that we found, we understood the verse in Matthew 18:18. What does that say? It says, whatsoever you bind in the earth, you will bind in the heaven. Whatsoever you loose in the earth will be loosed in the heavens. So, we know that to be the Spirit. So man did not want the righteous spirit released here on earth. He chose to build up a harlot and actually perjuring himself in the process. He also becomes known as the accuser, which is another mystery that we discovered when we followed out a bunch of words. So whatsoever you bind on earth, they bound her with a yoke around her neck, the daughter of Zion, with man-made law. That's what they did. And they were to hearken to the spirit of her covenant. And she was actually known as the mother upon this earth, which then kind of led us to break down that it's in Jewish folklore, the golem. But the term golem is actually in our Old Testament. It appears one time, the actual word golem, when David speaks of his substance. But in the folklore of Jewish folklore, it speaks of the golem being resurrected when a word is written on its forehead, and that word is emet. And we know that the word em in Hebrew means mother, and that in order to bring on the death of the golem, all you had to do was to erase the E. So what we supposed was that the word that will be written as the seal on this 144,000 would actually be mothers of truth. And when you bring on death, met would be death. That's what emet, you take the E away, you bring on death, means death. But when you erase that E, you actually erase the life giver from the equation. That's what we discovered they really wanted to do. They really wanted to get rid of the life giver. And when they did that, they brought on their own death. When they built up the harlot spirit, which would come under him and teach his laws and his religious ways, he actually brought on his own death, because she's the only one that gives life. So we understood all of these, and I am being very fast about this, the way that I'm going through. So whatsoever you loose in the heavens. Whatsoever you bind in the heavens. So we know what got loosed as the principality and the power of the air was the harlot spirit, which is basically man ruling himself, which leads us to other mysteries that we broke down, which we'll get to. So the spirit of Israel became yoked. Israel is a yoked heifer. Hosea 10:10-12. I will chasten them when I please. Nations will be gathered against them to put them into bondage for their double transgressions. Israel is like a trained heifer treading out the grain. An easy job she loves. But I will put a heavy yoke. That's the law, the man-made religious law, Torah, that fed out from Mount Zion as a law from God, supposedly, which was really from the harlot that he exalted, meaning he wrote the law. He didn't receive it at the mouth of daughter Zion. He brought in harlots, he married them, daubed up the breaches in David's wall, and changed the portion in the midst. So we broke all of those riddles down. But she is a heifer. She is also identified as the firstborn of the kingdom. On her tender neck, I will force Judah to plow. That's the Torah in allegory. And Israel to break up the hard ground. Verse 12, sow for yourself righteousness and reap the fruit of loving devotion. Break up your unplowed ground, for it is time to seek the Lord until she comes and sends righteousness upon you like rain. So the rain here we identified as your dew, as your doctrine from heaven, which then you understand in Deuteronomy 32. You'll get that understanding that your doctrine, your dew, is from heaven. So, Song of Songs, look not upon me because I am black, because the sun hath looked upon me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyard, but my own vineyards have I not kept. So she's saying right there just what we read in Hosea 10, 10, 11, and 12, that Judah came to plow, and she was heavily yoked, meaning that she was going to teach his religious lie to her children, but only when she began the breaking up of the hard ground for her own seed would her vineyard be returned back to her, as stated in Hosea 2. And so we see that she says, "Look not upon me because I am black. The sun hath looked upon me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyard, but my own I have not kept." And so you get this allegorical terminology at play in Hosea 10:10 and 11. Israel is like a trained heifer treading out the grain, an easy job she loves. So she loved her job, and she did not depart from it. She says, they tell lies against me and gnash upon me with their teeth, and they bring false witnesses against me, and I don't even know what they're talking about. And then she says in Psalm 69, she says, "Now I must restore that which I took not away." So she's talking about the restoration of the children under the spirit of her original covenant. But man chose to tear her down, because what it meant for her covenant to be at play, if we go to Proverbs 1, we know that father was to instruct the children, "You hearken to your mother's law. You don't hearken to mine." Nope, nope. And that's why you get the Shulamite black, from a false light that shined upon her, and they were angry with her. They made her keep their vineyard. That means with their lying spirit, which then takes us back to Isaiah 54, which again we understood what that meant. More are the children of the desolate than if she has a husband. And when we look up the married wife there in that verse, Isaiah 54 verse 1, the married wife is Baal. So it's telling us he basically married himself, or the akin to a Jezebel spirit, she that would teach him and what he wanted the children taught, which was a lie, a religious lie that yokes her and builds him up as God upon this earth. So we break all of that understanding down when you get your allegorical language going. So now I'm going to backtrack, and we're going to take a look at briefly the doe of the morning found in Psalm 22, and then we're going to take a look at Psalm 106 as well. So which one's first here? Psalm 106 is first. And when I was making my notes, I thought it was relevant. It was very important to read what was going on here, because one of them, and I ain't wrote it down, so I'm going to be mixed up mess here is what I'm going to be. What we understood was that the plague on Israel in the Exodus, when those serpents was coming in and biting them, it truly was about the contamination of the woman's seed, and it states it right out. It was a plague on the woman's seed. Now, I don't know, I can't remember if it says it in Psalm 106 or if it says it in Numbers or in Exodus. I can't remember exactly where, because what we were really covering was the riddles and the mysteries that we had unlocked with this key of David. So where are we going to start? I think we'll start so we're in Psalm 106, and we're going to start we'll start at verse 24 is where we're going to start at. So yea, they despised the pleasant land. Well, what was the pleasant land? Well, the pleasant land was simply another term for Israel. And what we come to realize is they divided Israel. All right? That was part of our understanding with this key of David, that they divided the pleasant land, known as these daughters of Zion, into two covenants. At an allegory you see in Galatians 4. And in Galatians 4 it says these two women are an allegory to two covenants. One identified as Hagar, which is under the bondage of the law that came from Sinai. Now we know it come from Sinai. Yes, Moses come down with the 10 Commandments first, but then when he saw that the children of Israel had turned to an idolatrous idol, they were playing the idolater there and worshiping a calf, the image of a calf. So they changed the glory of the daughter of Zion to a calf, and calf there is male that they give. So it was being, they were being very tricky about the way that they were going about turning everything on its head, really, and in the end, really driving her head down into the ground. And that's what God says in Isaiah 29. You told the Creator, the potter, that she had no power over the clay, and you turned everything on its head, is what you did. That's what she's saying. You turned everything upside down when you rejected a covenant with my righteous daughters, and in essence you split it, my pleasant land, into two, so into a harlot that would teach your lies and exalt you as God and allow your laws to yoke her. And so we find those two women in Galatians 4 as allegorical to two covenants. I don't think it's as allegorical as they would like you to believe. I think it's actually a living thing here on earth that we're bearing witness to with our eyes. Let's go back to the atlas. So what's the atlas? It means to carry, but atlas, let me see here, did I write the note down? Atlas is the topmost vertebrae of the backbone, articulating with the occipital bone of the skull. The occipital lobe is the visual processing center. So it's at the back of the head. There's a part called the atlas that attaches to the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe is responsible for your visual information and how you see the world. And it's ironic that that center at the back of your head is actually in the shape of a triangle, which then you actually see it taking you to the capstone in Zechariah 4, which is identified as a feminine, which we identified as that mountain that is cut out without hands, that smashes those 10 toes on that idol of a king that you must bow down to as your God. And so she's cut out without hands, the Holy Spirit in the end, which will fill out more and more as we go. So our understanding is growing here. And so the occipital lobe, atlas also means to carry, all right? So they're carrying a burden, the seven eyes of God that moves to and fro in the world and is registering information, which also takes you to the Greek word eídō. And that Greek word eídō means you are to take in information through your physical eyes, and that information that you come away with, that you formulate from your occipital lobe, ought to be able to bring your physical world together with your spiritual world and give you an understanding of what God is talking about. That's what it's saying. And so it'll take you to the word eídō, is what it'll do with your atlas and your occipital lobe and your seven eyes of God. And so we understood that to be the capstone, identified as the mountain that'll smash those toes on that false idol image of a king as your Lord and God that you will bow down to. And then that mountain itself, identified as Zion, grows into a mountain, which is also then identified as the government of God here upon earth, that man cast down, didn't want in rule, wanted to rule himself, which then also takes us to the abomination that maketh desolate, which is akin to that Isaiah 54, the married wife, Baal, he married himself, which then just leads to a harlot spirit that'll teach his man-made religious lies and laws, which then makes her desolate. And yet more are the children of the desolate spirit than of she who has a husband, than of she who will teach his religious lies, which is why the Shulamite says, look not upon me, because I am black, because the sun, the false light, has looked upon me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyard, but my own I have neglected. So when she begins to speak the spirit of her covenant, then she is saw as being rebirthed out of the dust of the earth, which you see in Isaiah 29. So I'm completely not going by my notes at all now. I'm completely lost. So we began in Psalm 106. So this is going to take us through what was going on in the Exodus. This is an overview, so I would recommend really going in and reading all of Psalms 106 to see what was going on further in the Exodus that maybe they don't give us in so much detail. So verse 24, yea, they despise the pleasant land, they believe not. Is this his word? Her word. The presence of God was identified as the daughter of Zion through the key of David. And the notes gets a little bit more extensive. We'll go into how we identified it and the passages that we used. Verse 25, but they murmured in their tents and hearkened not unto the voice of the Lord. Now, I'm going to stop there because, and I didn't write it down, so I'm really going to be out of whack here. But what we realized, one of the riddles that we broke down, was what was in view with the vipers that were coming in and biting the men, and it does specify the men of Israel were being poisoned by the vipers, by these poisonous serpents. All right, keep that in mind. So they murmured in their tents. Who was murmuring in their tents? Again, it was these men that were murmuring in their tents against the Holy One of Israel, identified as the daughter of Zion, that the men of Israel, and it was of Israel, the men of Israel, that were supposed to be in covenant with these daughters of Zion, known as the glory of God upon this earth, known as the presence of God, known as the Spirit of God. So, but they murmured in their tents, and they hearkened not unto the voice of the Lord. Therefore she lifted up her hands against them to overthrow them in the wilderness, and to overthrow their seed also among the nations, and to scatter them in the lands. So who got scattered? Well, when we understand what the men of Israel were actually doing to the righteous daughters of Israel, we see them actually casting them out of the land of Israel, no longer wanting them in covenant as their other half, their spirit. And we get Job saying, I made a covenant with mine eyes, why then should I think upon a maid? For what portion of God is there from above? So he's saying, my wife that I took in covenant, representing the Spirit of God from above. That's what he's saying. But there's a lot more that goes along with this. So she overthrew their seed. And that's when she says to them, if you don't want my glory, you don't want my scepter, you don't want my crown, you don't want my rule, then I'll take my righteous daughters and I will cast them out into the lands of the Gentiles. Which then takes you back to your understanding of the Azazel goat and her bearing double on her head for what the nation of Israel was doing. And it's also the double we get synonymous with the feminine, because whenever she gave birth to a female child, she had to be cleansed 66 days. That's double. So she was bearing the responsibility of the sin for what the harlot spirit was doing, as well as for what she herself was committing after the acts of violence that was perpetuated against them by these men of Israel, at which point she gets cast out. We also see Solomon perpetuating great violence against them in the land when he chose to daub up their gates that they rightfully passed through to give the laws to Israel from the house in the forest of Lebanon. And it was an extensive study that we did. Well, actually, it was a course of videos that we began to really get a hold and a grasp on what that house in the forest of Lebanon really represented, which was where the congregation or the assembly of God met, identified in Psalm 69 as women that would pass through these gates as the living water that flowed from Lebanon. She's identified as a fountain, a garden sealed, again taking you back to this idea of the covenant of the lilies. And she's identified in Song of Songs 4:12-15 as your living water that flowed from the north kingdom which is where your queen was supposed to come from before they decided to write king, king, king in here. And so we see that. So they joined themselves also unto Baal Peor and ate the sacrifices of the dead. Thus they provoked her to anger with their inventions, and the plague break in upon them. Now, I guess it's not in this passage, but it does specify, and I believe it is Numbers, the book of Numbers, where it says the plague break upon them, and it specifies that it was the contamination of the woman's seed. So they were looking to bring in the harlots. Who was looking to do this? Baal and Balak. That's why it says they joined themselves also unto Baal Peor, the Mount Peor, Mount of Baal. And Baal links us to your husband, 1167, who wants to be your Lord and Master. And so when Baal, what we understood about these vipers that were coming in and biting the men, was actually allegorical to the women that Baal told Balak when he couldn't curse the nation of Israel, when he couldn't curse the righteous daughters. He told Balak, and Balak said to him, he said, "What good are you to me? I hired you to curse this nation," that he was absolutely terrified of, because they were massive inside. They were a behemoth nation is what they were, and they were ruled by the daughters of Zion, the women. And the surrounding Adamic nations that surrounded the nation of Israel come to be known as thorns and thistles that surrounded the woman's seed. Now, we know Adam rejected a covenant with the righteous spirit and chose to build himself up a harlot, and so he could write his own laws. And Baal continued this idea on, right, with Balak, who says, "I want you to curse them." And when he can't, Baal says, "Go get your women and we'll send them in to seduce the men of Israel." And what that come to look like was the men murmuring in their tents, not hearkening unto the voice of the Lord, which was heard through the daughters of Zion, who was supposed to be the other half of their covenant. So Baal sends them women in to poison the doctrine of the daughter of Zion, the law, which was seen as a pure living water. It was seen as a pure silver with no dross in it. There was no blood, violence imputed into these daughters' laws. But they began to murmur when these women from the surrounding Adamic nations, who already held this guile of their man-made religious lie and law on their tongue, and they went in and they began to seduce the men of Israel with this lie that tickled their ears. It was like honey on their tongue, but it was cobra's venom in their stomach. It was no longer living water flowing out of their bellies. It was poison. And so it became all about this plague that was contaminating the woman's seed. We know Eve's seed was the blessed seed, and of her came the nation of Israel. And then when they grew to be this behemoth nation that you see identified, they try to make it again a male in Job 38 or 40, I forget which chapter as usual. But you get the behemoth in view, and it's simply Israel when she is moving in the manner that she is supposed to be moving in and doing the things that she needs to be doing. Then she is greatly blessed and she grows to be this huge behemoth nation. Another name for her comes to be the living creature that they saw laid out in the form of an X or a cross, but it represented the woman's seed. The X chromosome represents the matriarch or the monarch of Israel, the woman's seed, and you traced your lineage through the daughters. You would have a surname that came from the daughters, so it wouldn't be a surname, it would be a mother's name. But when the men cast them off and took on the lies of the harlot spirit that came in from the surrounding Adamic nations through Baal and Balak, they actually cast off their own scepter, their own crown, and their own queen, who was to rule with the living water that would give eternal life. And so they become poisoned. And so they provoke her to anger with their inventions. We see the inventions, the further inventions, we break this down by understanding Jeremiah 23. And again, we see it's all about Baal. It's about the men prophesying about the burden of the Lord. We identify the burden of the Lord as the children of Mother God, and they're saying, oh, the burden of the Lord, the burden of the Lord. The children are too much for a mother to deliver. Well, who else do they think's going to deliver children? And Mother says, you will not say the burden of the Lord anymore, because if you keep saying the burden of the Lord, then I will put this burden on you, and I'll make sure that your sword, your tongues end up turning against one another. And she says, you'll be no burden to me, because I will not deliver you. I will be no mother to you, because I'm not going to deliver you. Because you prophesy imaginations, you make up visions, and then you hand it on father to son or from brother to brother, and you point your finger and you take the word, the living word, out of my chosen method of the message was through my daughters of Israel, and you cast them down for a made up vision, and you preach Baal. You preach a male husband and the deliverance of children through a father that you're hearing from. And she says, I didn't send you at all. So we see all of this coming together to identify really what was going on. So they joined themselves unto Baal Peor and ate the sacrifices of the dead. Thus they provoked her to anger with their inventions, and the plague break in upon them. So they became poisoned with the lying theology through these harlots, this harlot spirit that fallen Adam had built up in the nations that surrounded the woman's seed, which was Israel, which was Eve's seed. Which then takes us again to Galatians 4. These two women are an allegory to two covenants. One that comes under the bondage of the man-made law, and the other one identified as Sarah, representing the spirit that comes from above, identified as the mother of us all, Mother Jerusalem, and it's under her law that you are freed. You will no longer bear this yoke, and that is the same yoke, light burden that Christ says, come, take of me, my burden is light. And that's why it was light. All right, now, okay, so we keep reading here. Then stood up Phinehas and executed judgment, and so the plague was stayed. So at the point that Phinehas has executed this judgment, if I've got the part right, it's where a man from the Israelite camp brings in a Midianite woman, or I think, and he gets up with his spear and he stabs the Israelite man through, and he stabs the woman through the belly, and it states it was the belly. So we are looking at the contamination of daughter Zion's seed, children that would hearken to the spirit of her covenant, the mother's law, Mother Israel's law, and the fathers was to point at that, and then they decided, no, we like what the harlots got to say better than what the other half of our covenant has to say. And so they begin to want this law. They begin to hearken for this poison. And then you see Moses instructed to make a brass serpent, which takes you to the seraphim, the fiery seraphim in Isaiah chapter 6, which is also identifying your glory. And so he's told to make this fiery serpent, this brass serpent, wrap it around a scepter, identifying the glory as your ruler, as the spirit of their covenant that they didn't want. And he was to raise it on a pole, and any who wanted to live, all they had to do was to look to that glory, which was representing the other half of their covenant, the spirit of their covenant, identified as the daughters of Zion. She was the wife of the original covenant that they dealt treacherously with. Not only did Israel in the Exodus, the men of Israel, deal treacherously with this spirit of his covenant, you then see Judah in Malachi chapter 2 pulling the same stunt, dealing treacherously with the wife and with the spirit of his covenant. Yet is she the wife of his covenant, it states. And it states he began to write violence. He began to perpetuate violence against this other half of his covenant. And he wrote blood into her waters. That's what he did. And so we were able to break down all of these riddles. All right. And so for Phinehas, that executed judgment, it was counted unto him for righteousness unto all generations forevermore. They angered her also at the waters of strife, so that it went ill with Moses for their sakes. Now here you see what took place was when Moses got so mad at the children of Israel for not following the spirit of the covenant, he actually gets mad and he strikes the rock when he was supposed to speak tenderly to it for the water. So the allegory that you see of the rock with the water is the daughters of Zion are identified as your shepherdesses with the word, that is to teach the flock the law of heaven. And so that's a rock with the word, and she is identified in Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 18. She says, I chose you out to be my special people, my particular people, and then you turned on me. And she says, your mark, and she's talking about their genetic markers, when these women from the surrounding Adamic nations come in and attack by the men on this female nation that was a behemoth, a living creature laid out as the cherubim, is what you're looking at there. Israel as your cherubim, the four directions, which was the four major tribes, most numerous, and then their emblems on each one of these angles. And so they contaminated her seed, right, is what they did. So I lost my train of thought. They provoked her spirit. They did not destroy the nation concerning whom the Lord commanded them. So they didn't destroy these nations that surrounded them, that was coming in and contaminating the woman's seed, because the men chose to take a harlot unto them instead of the spirit of their real covenant. And they refused to destroy this nation, and God had a law, supposedly, that the men of Israel were not to take wives from the surrounding Adamic nation. And then all of a sudden, I believe it's in Deuteronomy 15, that law gets overturned. Well, you know, it's the hand of men in the Torah writing what they want, and it gives them the permission to defile these women. And when should they decide they don't really want them as a wife, then they're not allowed to sell them, but they can still get rid of them, right? And so that was, it's just so telling. God is not fickle. God does not change. And yet, all of a sudden, that law gets changed. It gets changed because it gets changed by the hand of men who's just loving that honey on their tongue and tickling their ears while they get to write their own laws and yoke their own sisters under their own man-made laws and play God. And that's what the key of David has allowed us to break down. And so much more. And so they did not destroy the nations. You know what they did? They brought in the daughters and they married them. And what comes to be on top of Zion is the harlot spirit in covenant with the men of Israel. And that man-made religious lie and law feeds out to the four corners of the globe and becomes the false foundation wherein we begin to write our law system on it. That's right. And so God that you forgot is identified as your rock. In Deuteronomy 32 verse 18, she says, you forgot the rock that writhed in pain to birth you, and you're not getting a male out of that. It was the mother Israel, the spirit of her covenant that they did not want. They did not want her living water that come from her as the rock of Israel, which again you find as the queen in Joseph's blessings. It says, from thence will come the stone of Israel. Your stone is your foundation that you are founded upon. And they were to be founded upon daughter Zion's law, mother Israel's law. And they are found casting her off and instead writing their own laws, and a harlot that permits him to do so and then begins to teach this lie to the vineyard. And so, more are the children of the desolate than of she who has a husband. So she still promised that she's going to have them all. And God says to her, mother says to her daughter in Psalm 2, she says, ask of me the nations and I'll give them all to you. And that's in accordance with what she was promising her daughter. In Isaiah 49, Ephraim is the firstborn of her womb. That is a woman, a female, a daughter, which is why in the stacking order in the creation account, the woman is the last thing created because she is the firstborn. And it was supposed to be the spirit of her covenant that ruled the nations. And they cast her down, they put her on ring to play as harlot. That's what you see constantly spoken of once you get your understanding of what the key of David is. All right. Okay, so how long is the video getting too big? Because I am going to have to break this down. So it is getting pretty long. My hair is really flat. Anyway, sorry. And okay, so let's finish reading this passage. I ain't even got to the dough of the morning yet. So they didn't destroy the nations, but were mingled among the heathen and learned their works, their ways, their laws. Israel did not learn God's ways. They want to say the Torah came from God. The Torah did not come from God. The Torah came from man's hand. And he built up the harlot as this mason that builds up the key of Solomon so he could exalt himself as God. That means he wrote his own laws. And those laws, supposedly from God, fed out to the four corners of the world and becomes a false foundation for our governments, laws, and systems to be founded upon. Over time, over history, this is what you'll see plays out. All right. Okay. So they were mingled. So what we find in the word mingled is actually the admixture of doctrine. Blood imputed into her law, her silver words, her purified words, her water flowed like a living water from Lebanon as the government of God upon this earth. She says, I will build the virgin daughter Israel, Zion, Jerusalem back. She will be restored back. The dominion belongs to the daughter of Zion. She was the stronghold of the nations, meaning it was through her that you were gave eternal life because of the laws that she held in her mouth, no guile, because it come from mother above. And again, Proverbs 1 says the father was to give instruction to the child. You adhere to the laws of your mother, and these sons did not. These fathers did not. They departed from her truth, and they cast her down, and they built up a harlot that would serve under them. Now, okay, so they were mingled among the heathen and learned their works, and they served their idols, which were a snare unto them. Now it says in many passages the snare they lay for her to fall into, at the end they actually fall in it themselves. And that is the truth, because everything from God they have created, male, male, male. These men have come to fall in love with themselves, which is the abomination that maketh desolate. A man inside of a man will lead to utter death, because he's not hearkening to the spirit of his covenant. The harlot is not hearkening to the spirit of her covenant, which was to teach the laws of her mother Israel to the sons and daughters, not only of the nation of Israel as promised this time around, but to the Gentile nations as well, where she actually gets cast out into. As this heifer burned to ashes, and in a sense gets cast out to cleanse the temple, the body. All right? And so you see that all in allegory is what you see over and over again once you understand this key of David. Thus they were defiled with their own works and went a-whoring with their own inventions. And the men, it is stated, went whoring after the women. They went whoring after their doctrine. And they chose a covenant with El-Berith, that you see Baal in Gideon's day, who Gideon was battling, was these men of Baal, who was trying to wipe out the righteous spirit out of the land, the daughters of Zion, and was trying to uphold that covenant with the harlots. And you see Elijah doing the same thing. His battle was against Baal, and the harlot spirit that they exalted, that's what their battle was against. Because they looked to wipe out the righteous spirit, which was the spirit of their covenant, which was daughter Zion. That's what she was called, which is the key of David, which is in direct opposition to the key of Solomon, which is the harlot spirit that those men of Baal build up in the earth to teach his laws. All right, now, where do we go from here? Okay, so we'll finish reading this, and then I'm going to move to Psalm 22, and then I'm going to have to call it on that for tonight. Okay, let's backtrack. So I'm still in Psalm 106 trying to get through this. Thus were they defiled with their own works and went a-whoring with their own inventions. That takes us to Jeremiah 23, like I said. Verse 40, therefore was the wrath of God kindled against her own people. You see, she chose them in Deuteronomy 32 to be her particular people, which then you find they're not carrying the spots of her people anymore, which was identified as the spots of her XX chromosome, her daughters of Zion. They became contaminated by the plague that break in upon them, and they no longer held the mark of her children, the chromosomes of her children, the XX, the mothers of Israel, which was her chosen method. It was her spirit upon them. She chose them as her special inheritance. The Spirit did. So therefore was the wrath of the Lord kindled against her people, insomuch as she abhorred her own inheritance. Again, it takes us back to what Job says. Verse 41, and she gave them into the hand of the heathen, and they that hated them ruled over them. Verse 42, their enemies also oppressed them, and they were brought into subjection under their hand. Many times did she deliver them, but they provoked her with their counsel, and were brought low for their iniquity. Nevertheless, she regarded their affliction when she heard their cry. And she remembered for them her covenant, and repented according to the multitude of her mercies. So it says of these daughters that passed through the wall, or over the wall, in Joseph's blessings, that they hated her, they shot at her, and it is her, they got him, but it's her, the branches, the daughters, that's passing over the wall that the archers are shooting at, and it states they hated her, yet her covenant, her bow, her covenant remains strong by the Almighty God. That is the spirit of daughter Zion that actually had to come off of her own inheritance, because they began to play the harlot, because man cast her down and did not want her in covenant. Which then you see the commander of the host in Daniel chapter 8, is it 7 or 8? Her host being handed over, which is basically to the harlot spirit that man built up, and it says truth was cast to the ground, and equity could no longer enter in fairness. They yoked their sister, under their man-made religious lie and law so they could play God. He. And So, she remembered her covenant and repented according to the multitude of her mercies. And she made them also to be pitied of all those that carried them captives. Save us, O Lord our God, and gather us. That's the Asaph, which we identified as your female assembler in the Ecclesiastes chapter 12. They got preacher there, but it's female assembler who is representing the spirit that will gather the Proverbs, that is going to put forth a reproach to fallen Adam, which is shown us in Psalm 50, where she says, you thought I was just like you, but I'm not. Now will I set the case in order, and I will reprove you. I will reproach you. I will rebuke you for all of your lies and your false testimonies that you have given against me and my daughters. So, save us, O Lord our God, and gather us from among the heathen to give thanks unto thy holy name. That's the Holy One, daughter Zion of Israel, and to triumph in thy praise. Blessed be the Lord God of Israel from everlasting to everlasting. And let all the people say, Amen. Praise ye the Lord. All right. Now, quickly, when we go to Psalm 22, I wanted to make another quick link. And so some of this may be rehashed in the next video because I'll forget what I threw in and what I didn't throw in. So in Psalm 22, you get this title to the tune of the doe of the morning. So the doe of the dawn. Now this is an interesting correlation to make, because in the next video we'll maybe try to get to doing this better. We identify the presence of God, the Spirit of God, as the daughters of Zion. She's also identified as a hind. She's identified as a she-goat, which is also another word for the hind, they say, which has been falsely translated in Proverbs 5. And it should actually be read she-goat. So this may well be the same, the she-goat of the morning, which is important because she's in the Genesis 15:9 covenant. She's the lily of the covenant. She's, according to the doe of the morning, there are a flock of she-goats being shepherded by the Shulamite in Song of Songs. She's also Shiloh. They refused the gently flowing waters of Shiloh. They did not want the spirit of her covenant, the daughter Zion's covenant. They did not want her law. And so this living creature that you see laid out as a behemoth, really, and you get this four-headed creature, which is actually the insignias of four separate tribes of Israel, as this cherubim that Balak was absolutely terrified of. And so they really wanted to gnash at her and tear her down and shoot at her and take her all knowledge of her covenant out of existence so they could rule and play God. But the doe of the morning, you actually see, what do we see when the presence of God, which is identified as the camp of Mahanaim, it's a double camp. The Shulamite is shepherding a flock of she-goats. It's a double camp identified as Mahanaim, which is what Jacob calls the camp of God when he meets it. And he wrestles with this angel all night until, what does it say? Until daylight. Until daylight. So she, the angel here, and her name would have been Israel, or daughter Zion. That's what she would have been known as. And so she wrestles with Jacob, a male, who was fighting for the blessing to have her name bestowed upon him. And what does it say? She fought him. It's got him. All angels are male. Everything's male, like I said. There's absolutely nothing female except the negative to be blamed, to wear the yoke of it all, really. Why he gets to play God and exalt himself and make the laws and tell you what you can and can't do, according to God, not him, though. And that's the big fat lie on planet Earth, which is why we're in the mess that we are in. So she's the doe of what? The morning. The dawn. She's the doe, she-goat of the dawn. Right? And she says, I will awaken the dawn. and one of the Psalms of David. She says, I will awaken the dawn. And here she is the doe of the morning, or the doe of the dawn. And this angel, which was identified as the presence of God, they're also known as the outcast, that no man sought a covenant with, this camp, which was headed by the Lord herself, 136, known as the daughter Zion. That's her number, Adonai, in scriptures. 136 is her number. And so she is shepherding, actually, her own camp that was rejected. The rejected spirit of man's covenant that got gnashed upon. And you see Jacob wrestling her for her very own birthright and blessing. And so she wrestles with him until dawn, right? When the dawn breaks is when the new day breaks, and she will have her birthright and her blessing restored back to her. That's what you find when you understand all of this. All right. So I'm not going to go through, and the video's getting to be quite long, and where this is going to be a three-parter, this will be quite a heavy-laden detail, of information that we're going to unload, that the key of David actually helped us to open. And of course, we'll finish off with the parting of the Red Sea. So the Red Sea represents an admixture of doctrine. Of course, your water, your pure water, and the blood that ended up being mixed into that. And the presence was shown parting that admixture of doctrine. And you get the symbology of a mother delivering her children through, which again takes you to Isaiah 42, which we'll discuss in the next video. She says, long time have I holden my peace. Now, or she says, long time have I been restrained. Now will I go forth as a travailing woman, and I will destroy and I will devour, and I will lead them in paths that they have not known. That is the spirit restored back to her covenant. That's Israel, rebirthed out of the dust of the earth in Isaiah 29, where Mother says, I hear a familiar spirit as of one who speaketh out of the dust of the earth. And she's familiar because she's holding Mother God's spirit law on her tongue. And so she is identified as being rebirthed out of the ashes. And you find that Lord 136 that lays amongst the ash heaps in Psalm 68. Which will carry over in our discussion in our next video. So again, we'll read Psalm 22, so I'll write that down as a note. We'll read Psalm 22, and we'll take a look at Psalm 68, because I just said we would look at that. And like I said, I ain't got nowhere near what I was supposed to do. I thought I'd just read these off quick, because they're detailed in so many of the videos. But I think it's so important to validate that the key of David has indeed opened up for us the riddles and the mysteries. It has absolutely unlocked so many of these riddles and mysteries that we really had no understanding of. And it says, the wisdom of your men will fail you. And that is found in Isaiah, I believe 29, it might be in 28, but it says they'll hand this book off and they'll say, tell me what it means, and they'll say, well, I cannot. Well, they cannot because, number one, they fell into the snares that they laid for us to fall into. And so without understanding the divine feminine and what was done to her as the key of David, you are not going to be able to unlock the mysteries of the scriptures that has been sealed off from our eyes and our understanding without understanding the key of David. And so there we go. That's the first part of the video. And you know where I am. I'm on number... Where am I? I'm only on the 7th point. Just this afternoon I wrote down 40 points alone, leaving a lot out. And I've still got 2 more pages of videos to go through to prompt my memory so I can write down other riddles and mysteries that we were able to unlock with the key of David. Because it's just so validated. I don't know how anybody can't understand. You know, number one, if you've never studied the Bible and you don't know what it says, then you're not going to be able to understand the key of David and how it unlocks so many passages. I'm quite surprised at how unlearned Christians are, supposed Christians and saints are, that supposedly know the Word and really don't know it at all. It's a shock to see the numbers so low. I have worked long and hard at breaking down these mysteries. I believe I am a trumpet of God. I believe I am part of the spirit of Moses as the witnessing group upon this earth, bearing witness to the truth, to the water, and to the blood that was spilled on this earth into the righteous covenant of the water of the daughter of Zion that flowed like a living water from Lebanon. And that's what I believe. Why I was handed the key of David was to share it. And I can't help but feel that my testimony is coming to an end. I've felt it for a while now. In the beginning, before I started to make videos to reveal what I had come to understand, the Spirit had been prompting me for, about a year that I needed to share what I knew. And so it took a while for me to step up and to actually begin making the videos, and I was really nervous, and I still am at times. But you can shut that off when you're trying to share something that you feel is fundamental and very important to our understanding. And now, I have to say 3 to 4 months, I've been getting the Spirit strongly encouraging me that I probably should be done now, because there's nothing else that I can share to you that is going to help you unlock the mysteries of the Scriptures like the key of David is going to do for you. And so I feel in my spirit, like I said, for the last 3 to 4 months, maybe since the summer even, that I'm being encouraged by the Spirit that, I probably should be done. So that's the video for tonight. I thank any who's watching trying to understand this theology. I appreciate you coming along on these studies. I encourage you to come along as we open up and unlock the mysteries of the Scriptures that we're supposed to know at this time. And I pray the Lord blesses you with an abundance of truth, an abundance of the pure living water. And I hope you all have a really nice evening. And thanks again for watching.